what we have now is we have the ability to compare the Normandy jumps with the Market Garden jumps, and we can see that Market Garden is not as thoroughly planned. It's hastily put together. It's got fatal flaws. We're not protecting the road between Nijmegen and so on and so on and so forth. But if you examine some of these cancelled plans, some of them were absolutely crazy.
Broadcasting from the center of the military universe, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This is the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast, the official podcast of America's Contingency Corps.
Hey there, this is Joe Bacino, host of the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast. Thanks for joining the show. Thanks for listening. This episode, the episode you are listening to at the moment, is part of our series on the 77th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. Market Garden was, of course, an unsuccessful Allied military operation of the Second World War. It was fought in the Netherlands from September 17th to September 25th, 1944. And here on the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast, we're looking at this operation from multiple perspectives, multiple angles over a series of episodes. Today we've got Paul Woodadge. Paul's a friend of ours. He came on the podcast to talk about the canceled airborne operations in August and September of 1944 and their role in the planning for Market Garden. In particular, he talked to us about Operation Comet. Comet was the planned airborne operation by the British 1st Airborne Division. It was scheduled for early September, and it wasn't fully canceled. It just kind of morphed into something bigger. Basically, it morphed into Market Garden. What was really interesting about this discussion is Paul explains the pressure on the Allied leadership to use airborne forces in some capacity, in some massive way. And that's something I had heard before, something I'd read in some American accounts of Market Garden, but he really does a phenomenal job of explaining it here. So, okay, a little bit about Paul. He was born and raised in Colchester, really a historic town in England, and he became an internationally recognized battlefield tour guide, primarily for the D-Day beaches. He did that, he started in 2002, and he discontinued his battlefield tour guide service in 2018, and he is now a filmmaker. You can find him, and you should find him. You should look for him on YouTube. His YouTube account is WW2TV. WW2, not the Roman numeral 2, but WW2TV. He does live streams about World War II. He has on really interesting guests, multiple guests at a time, and then he hangs the videos on there so you can go through and see his discussions and interviews and historic accounts. He wrote the book Angels of Mercy in 2013. It's a phenomenal book. I've got it here at the house. It recounts the incredible deeds of two 101st Airborne Division medics on D-Day. And it's always great talking to Paul. Always offers unique perspective. And, you know, he's never really afraid to challenge the traditional thinking around historic events. Here is my discussion with Paul Woodadge about the canceled airborne operations leading into Operation Market Garden.
Sounds great.
So, all right, well, I think, you know, in terms of the setup for the backdrop and setup of Operation Market Garden, you know, one of the stories here is the canceled airborne insertions. And I'm hoping maybe that's something you can talk to us a little bit about.
Yeah, sure.
About how that played into the planning and into the maybe some of the failures at Operation Market Garden.
Fine by me.
Yeah. So can you just explain to us the airborne insertions that were planned and why they were canceled?
Well, after D-Day, June the 6th, immediately they had the potential use of the British 1st Airborne Division to follow up what the British 6th Airborne Division had done by landing on June the 6th and coming in within a week or two. And there were various plans and operations, some of which were not much more than just guys sort of talking in a pub about possibilities. Others went as far as everybody boarding the aircraft and pretty much getting ready to taxi down the runway. So when we're looking at them now with the benefit of 70 plus years, it's hard to break down exactly which ones were, more likely to happen than others. Some had lots of staff officers working on them, some had less. But the thing is, there was between 15 and 23-ish is the number of operations that were planned. And they escalated once the first Allied Airborne Army had been created and Brereton and Browning get involved, because initially the only plans they could have really done would have been with the British 1st Airborne Division. Maybe they could have brought in a couple of independent parachute infantry regiments from the US forces that were not already deployed in Normandy. And then, by early July, the 101st Airborne's gone back to England. The 82nd Airborne's nearly started going back to England. And then you have the new army created. And that's when the plans escalate. And what's fascinating from my point of view is that we look at the flaws, and clearly there are flaws with the Market Garden plan. But these previous plans had as many, if not more, flaws. And you look at them and you think, well, what on earth were they planning with that one? And now they vary in what they were going to do. There were some in Normandy, kind of south of Caen, what would have eventually become the Falaise Gap. There were some jumps there that didn't happen. Others were into Brittany. The San Malo area was one of them, with the idea to kind of create a new port, essentially, to be able to bring supplies in that way, and maybe not have to do the landings in the south of France in August. The Walcheren Islands, which of course plays into things in Market Garden, because that's the whole Antwerp, Dutch coast port supplies issue. There was one planned there, but the really interesting one that connects directly with Market Garden is Operation Comet, which would have been happening on September the 10th or 11th. And it's nearly the same as the Market Garden plan, but much smaller. It's one division as opposed to three. And it didn't happen. It got converted, I suppose, into the Market Garden plan. But the thing is this Allied army is now sitting, the Airborne army, the Airborne armed force is there ready to do something with. And every time someone proposes a plan and it doesn't happen, it's just, in a sense, annoying the commanders more and more and more, because they want to do something. Our governments, American and British governments, have spent a lot of money training up these paratroopers. They've got a lot of resources behind it, and they're sitting there waiting to go. Now, the difficulty with comparing something like Market Garden to Normandy and the D-Day plans is that essentially the situation in France hadn't changed for months and months before the landing. So when it was planned, the objectives have been decided very early in the planning. Okay, there's a possibility of German reinforcements coming, and that's why the deception plan happens. But with Market Garden, or anything that would have happened in September, the situation on the battlefield is changing, not even day by day, almost minute by minute. And Eisenhower's broad front strategy is working, but at the same time, it's completely lacking in supplies. Everything is still coming from Normandy. Weather forecasters are predicting a bad winter. And there's this idea that if someone pulls together something ambitious and audacious, maybe we can do something to beat the arrival of the winter and change the battlefield. So, an airborne plan is going to happen. It's just going to happen. There's too much waiting now. There's too many people on high alert, so to speak, just waiting for it to happen. And it's a bit like when you go back to 1942 and when we analysed the Canadians going to Dieppe. The Canadian forces, someone had been in Britain for a long, long time, and they frankly would have accepted any plan they were offered because they just want to have a crack at Jerry. And the same thing applies very much to the airborne divisions that are sitting around. They just want to have a go. So I think that that contextual side of things gets forgotten a bit, because Market Garden is examined purely on its own merits and not looked into what was happening before, and not looked into the context of what's happening with the battle in Europe, if that makes sense.
It definitely makes sense. You're saying that paratroopers and the airborne leaders wanted to go. They wanted to do this insertion. Is there a sense that from the British and the American side, Montgomery and Eisenhower, that they developed these big airborne forces and they developed these divisions and then the First Airborne Allied Army, and that we basically need to use this force? Or is that oversimplifying things a little bit?
No, I think that's pretty much nail on head. And also not just using them because of their military capability, but using them because of what they represent in terms of the PR angle as well, because it really is the first combined American and British unit that's actually going in there. Okay, I know D-Day is, and the SHAEF and what have you has still been a multinational organization, but when you look at D-Day again, or Sicily or Italy, the divisions jumped under their own nation's command, effectively.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so Market Garden was not. Market Garden was a new force. The first Allied Airborne Army was a coexisting multinational force. The Poles even were involved in it, and so it looks good for the press as well. It looks good, and maybe a bit of guesswork on my part. There's almost a bit of an attempt to kind of correct some of the Monty Patton rivalries from early in the war and kind of send out this message that, you know what, the Americans and British are really happy working together. This is a new force. This is the best of Allied cooperation. And you've got this elite force. Well, I hate that word elite. I wish I hadn't used it now. But this elite force of airborne forces to go in and do something. And the other thing that I think gets overlooked is, in a situation with this broad front in September, if you've spent a lot of money training up paratroopers and you've got all the C-47s behind it and everything else behind it, the plan needs to be audacious, or otherwise don't bother. I mean, if you end up doing something that a group of a few dozen truck drivers could do on the ground on their own, then there's no point committing this incredible force. So it needs to be audacious. And you look at the history, I think that's what I've been looking back over the last year or so with what I've been doing, is that you look at the Russian jumps into Vyazma in 42, the Germans into Crete in 42, the Operation Mercury and things like that. They're all audacious, these plans, and they all have elements of them that go well and elements of them that don't go well. But there's just no point trying something that's just, run of the mill and, well, we'll just you just don't bother sending the paratroopers. It needs to be something very, very bold. And that's, I think, often gets overlooked.
I've heard a couple of different things. I think I always have this a little bit wrong, but why was Comet canceled? It wasn't big enough. There weren't enough airborne forces. There was weather. I think maybe a combination of things.
All of that. Yeah. All of the above. And again, the situation on the ground changed in a way differently than the planners perceived when they put together Comet. In the Comet, for example, doesn't have the seizing of Eindhoven by the Airborne Division. It only has Nijmegen and Arnhem, and it's just one division rather than three, because when they put the plan together, the anticipation would have been that the ground forces would already have got to Eindhoven, which was 2 weeks earlier than anywhere actually happened. But it does convey the fact that the operation is being planned with information that is changing and updating all the time, and they're trying to predict, okay, so where will the German line be next week? And frankly, they don't know where it's going to be in the next hour, let alone next week. And neither, by the way, the Germans know where their line's going to be either. This is the difficulty we have of looking at maps with phase lines and positions on them in September. So, the British are here, the Americans are there, the Germans are there, as if it's kind of some kind of set, like trench warfare aspect. What you'd need to do, if you were taking a period from, say, September the 1st to September the 17th, when Market Garden happened, is have some kind of animated map showing how these lines, because they're moving and changing all the time, and where we think that the Germans are, because the Germans are falling back, Army Group B is falling back, And where we think they're going to be is not necessarily where they're going to be. Where the Germans think we're going to be is not going to be. So Comet is cancelled. I don't know. Cancelled isn't even necessarily the right word. Because it morphs into Market Garden. What I find the most fascinating thing about Comet is to cure it. They both make it worse and better at the same time. In that one, they realize, okay, this needs to be bigger. One division can't do all this stuff. We need to have three. So that, I think we'd all agree that makes perfect sense. But in order to accommodate the three divisions, the drop zones have to be a little bit rejigged, because what's really interesting when you look at the Comet plans is that each of the bridges had a drop zone right beside the bridge, notably Arnhem. Now, this is one of the big things, well, if we're going into what went wrong with the Market Garden, is if ever you've walked from Ginkle Heath 9 miles west of Arnhem into Arnhem, you think, why on earth are they coming so far? It is, we all know that. We've seen that in the movie. It's a long way from the objective. And there is this area on the south side of the bridge in Arnhem that is not suitable to jump maybe a brigade into, certainly not big enough for a division to jump into, but you probably could jump a battalion or 2 battalions, or battalion and some gliders with armored cars, Tetrak tanks, universal carriers, armed jeeps, whatever. But in the Comet adapting to Market Garden, the drop zone beside the bridge and the bridges in Nijmegen as well are removed from the plan. Now that's curious, because that's one of the fatal flaws with Market Garden, is that, maybe if we'd had a force at the bridge earlier coming in by parachute, the coup de main side of things, and coup de main had been our ace up our sleeve in Market Garden with the gliders at Pegasus Bridge and so on and so forth. So it's interesting why that got rejected. But what is also interesting is that these operational plans, you can get them all at the you can go and view them all at the National Archives in London, but you don't really see the names of the officers who are attached to them necessarily, because it's lots of staff officers and lots of, in a sense, paper shufflers who are moving stuff around and putting things together, and they're pulling information from aerial photos and the intelligence and SIGINT and all that kind of stuff. And so when we all now refer to Market Garden being Montgomery's plan, which it was, it's not incorrect to say that. It is based on this work done by these essentially nameless clerks and staff officers who have been assessing the situation in Europe since June. They've been looking at an opportunity to use airborne forces, and they've been looking at submitting various plans that might make an immediate difference on the battlefield to improve the situation. And so, the Comet plan is fascinating, and yet everyone agrees it wouldn't have worked because it's too small. But they seem to overlook the fact that the drop zones by the bridges might have made a significant difference. Well, would have, I think.
Right. Okay. All right, good. No, I appreciate that. This is really helpful for us. I think just to maybe put a finer point on something that I think is not fully understood or in debate. So your purview here is that these airborne operations were leading into Market Garden were canceled. That had a cascading effect of making this a larger airborne operation, ultimately effectively making this almost like a fait accompli, that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, that we were going to do this. It was going to be massive in size, scale, ambition. And, ultimately, I guess in some, you'd have to say, or maybe you wouldn't say, massive and spectacular in its failure.
Yeah. And I think what we have now is we have the ability to compare the Normandy jumps with the Market Garden jumps, and we can see that Market Garden is not as thoroughly planned. It's hastily put together. It's got fatal flaws. We're not protecting the road between Nijmegen and so on and so on and so forth. But if you examine some of these cancelled plans, some of them were absolutely crazy. So if you it's particularly the ones that got as far. I mean, 2 or 3 of them got as far as, company commanders briefing their men, and men getting into the aircraft. Others got as far as the divisional commanders knowing, some as, regimental commanders knowing, battalion commanders knowing. But there's an awful lot of people within that force, in 1st Airborne, in 17th Airborne, so on, who have seen some of these plans that are, make Market Garden look completely sound. And so when Market Garden comes along, we look at it because we know what happened and we see all the flaws, but they're probably looking at it in an incredibly positive way because, as I say, compared to these ones they've been offered in the previous days, it was like, hang on, this one seems to make sense. Yeah, we've got the bridges there. We can drive in there. Second Army comes up. We're on the way to the Ruhr. Yeah, that makes more sense. It makes more sense than the one into Brittany. It makes more sense than some of those ones. So we know it's fatally flawed, as I say, but for those guys at the time, it maybe had seemed less flawed than we now know it to be.
All right, Paul. Well, look, I appreciate your time here. I just wanted to get that kind of nugget on Comet, these failed airborne operations. This is kind of a broader contextualizing of the war, and just really appreciate your voice and your insight here.
No problem. And while we're here, if there's anything else you want to ask, we might as well do that. But yeah, it's nice. It's good. I appreciated your efforts last year to look at it, and there's this whole element, as we talked about last year or the last time, is that there's the nationalistic approach to Market Garden. So Americans instinctively blame Montgomery, and British now, the trend is now blaming James Gavin and this, that, and the other. And this nationalistic kind of entrenched views is somehow not really good for the discourse about it, and I've got a week of Arnhem programs coming up on my channel this month. And one of the things I'm definitely not doing is getting in a group of historians and saying, okay, so where did it go wrong? Because you're not going to change, or rather, who was to blame? Because anybody watching that, you're not going to change anybody's mind. Whether they're American, British, Australian, or German, they've all got their belief into where it went wrong, and they've all got their armchair solution to make it better. So a discussion ends up going nowhere because, it's like politics, isn't it? How many times have you ever convinced any of your friends on social media to change their views because of a comment you made? The answer is never. People are never going to go, oh yeah, that's a good point. So Market Garden has had that effect of becoming very, very territorial and marginalized, and people don't really want to open their mind up to changing their interpretation of it, I think.
I don't understand this, because you are not going to change people's views on news of the day. On if somebody's, for example, is anti-vax, you're not going to change their view. This is something that's happening in the moment. Yep. We've formed an opinion, and we're holding to that. But Market Garden is not something that affects people's lives right now. It happened 77 years ago. Maybe I'm overstating it. I feel like it's still an emotional touchstone for some people, not in the United States. And I don't really understand why.
I think I agree. I don't know why. I don't know why we can't look at it as intelligent human beings and say, okay, look at where James Gavin made some errors in Nijmegen. Look at where this did that, and why can't people be not blamed, but just held accountable and say, okay, and understand, and therefore it's not just putting the blame somewhere. It's can we understand why at the time that decision was made, and not forgive them for it, but sort of put it into the context of doing it. Because, that's the thing. We've had so long now to think about how Market Garden went wrong. And we can cure it very easily. A few pen strokes, and don't do that, make sure that done. Boom, it's all worked out. But as we know, Comet was planned for September the 10th, so Market Garden gets put together in about a week, but basing itself on these previous plans. The situation on the ground has changed. The 6th German Army Group B is in a different position. 9th and 10th SS are in an area that we didn't quite know about, although we did know about that. The drop zones, the flight paths, all that worked out. And the flight paths is one of the things that is consistent all the way through, because the RAF and the Bomber Command and the Allied 8th Air Force had warned the planners where all the heavy flak areas were. So whatever, if we're going to do anything via the into that area of the Netherlands, the routes in are kind of not going to change now. We pretty much know exactly where the dangerous areas are, and that's an interesting aspect as well. By the way, is that there'd clearly been a policy doctrinal decision that we don't want to lose too many aircraft getting in. It's better to not lose aircraft getting in and have the men further away from where they want to be than have the men closer to where they're going to be, but lose a few more aircraft on the way in. And that's an interesting thing that doesn't get, I think, reanalyzed, is that probably most of the commanders on the ground would have said, okay, I'd rather lose 10% of my aircraft on the way in and 10% of my troops in those aircraft in worst case scenario, but have the 90% of my force right on target on the DZs than only lose, 2% of my aircraft coming in and 2% of my men, but have them needing to cover 10 miles to get to their objectives. I think most of the airborne commanders would have preferred the intact force closer but smaller. But for whatever reason, and that may be Brereton's influence, because Brereton is an Air Force guy as opposed to Browning be a ground guy. Because I know at one point we're going to talk about that, and and the politics behind Brereton and Browning and all those is a bit complicated. It's all opinions again, but it is interesting that whatever they think about it, they come from a previous school of thinking. One comes from an air point of view, one comes from a ground point of view, which somehow didn't align in a sense of the, but then again, that's all hindsight. That's all us analyzing it post event.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I think, if there's maybe a takeaway here, key takeaway or something to land this on, and I didn't prep you for this, but I'm sure you're loaded for bear on this one, is what's something about Market Garden that's come into the lexicon or the mythos that's not true? What's something about Market Garden that's misunderstood?
Oh, there's
several
things.
But
I mean, there's the British stopping for tea after the bridge and not going on.
And that I think is probably just came out of the movie.
Yeah. And it's not that the event didn't happen. It's just there's the contextual side of it, and the fact that if you've ever been on that road and you've seen that isolated embankment that pushes on from the bridge there, if we had carried on sending those tanks down that road without the supporting infantry and particularly the artillery and to be able to support them, it would have been a disaster. So, but the way the British officer in the film speaks to Robert Redford just casts the whole situation in the British guy is being a bit of an arrogant twit about it, and that Robert Redford is the hero, and that's left a bit of a sour point, I think. But again, and I think sadly most of the tropes and myths we're left with are based on the movie. I think that's another thing I think that gets forgotten as well is how congested for the British and how contested the second lift was. Because the movie and most portrayals have a kind of a linear, the men land, they start moving towards their objectives, so on. They forget that the second lift was under 5. People have this idea that because the first lift was so good, sunshine, air, paratroopers descending, Dutch civilians waving, that continued through the latter jumps. And of course it didn't. By the next jump, particularly for the British. I mean, the Germans and Dutch SS are there, with 20mm cannons and stuff, firing into the aircraft and firing into the paratroopers all the way down. That gets overlooked. There's lots of little things really, but they're mostly movie derived. And I think also going back to what we're saying, this idea that it's completely Montgomery's plan and that everything is he's had the entire idea, and also on that subject, the fact that Eisenhower signed it off. That's when Americans tell me, but Montgomery should never have done it. And you go, well, okay, and I'm with you on that, but then Eisenhower shouldn't have signed off on it. So Eisenhower had complete power of veto. He's his own man. Montgomery is junior to Eisenhower. If Eisenhower doesn't like the plan, Eisenhower just says no. Rejig it, do it again, submit it again next week, but we're not doing it. He did. He had faith in it, or he had faith in Montgomery, or he had faith in the Allied Airborne Army. Whatever it was, he had faith in. So or he felt
some sort of pressure to cater to the British plan here and maybe the British American politics, or is that overthinking it?
I don't think Eisenhower is the kind of person to bow to any of that kind of pressure. I think that's what makes Eisenhower so very, very good at what he did, is he was his own man. He would absolutely take on all the advice. And that's one of the reasons you look at his team, people like Lee Mallory, and Lee Mallory is a bit of an arse, I think, frankly. But Lee Mallory, I always say the value he has to Eisenhower is he's very negative, in that he's always pointing out the worst case scenarios. So and other people on his team are very, it'll be fine, let's go for it. And I think what Eisenhower is very good at is listening to the positives and negatives about a plan or an operation or a piece of technology, and then weighing it up and then finding his own mid view in between the two extremes. And that's that. So he's the best type, I think, of manager, an example of leadership, in that he will listen to people's ideas, he will take them all on board, and then ultimately he makes his own decision based on it. And I think that would have had exactly the same situation with Market Garden. Montgomery would have outlined the plan, Eisenhower would have considered it, but if he hadn't wanted to do it, he would have said no. I just cannot see Eisenhower, being influenced enough to commit an operation of that force just because he feels a bit of pressure from someone to get. I don't think that's Eisenhower's in his locker. I'm not saying other commanders might not have done that, but Eisenhower is not that kind of person, I don't think.
He certainly escapes just about any blame, though, in history. I mean, he's really not mentioned, at least not in the United States. He's really not mentioned when you talk about Market Garden.
No, he has reached a level of pedestal acclaim that I think he'll never come off. There's certain people in your history, I think, kind of Lincoln, Washington, have reached a level. Interesting, in Britain, Churchill kind of had, and then he's slightly wobbled recently when people looked at, Bengali famine and this, that, and the other in his but I think Eisenhower has just reached a level of untouchableness that he just moves through all these debates, and people pull apart Patton and Montgomery's relationships and what went wrong with Sicily, what went wrong with Italy. But Eisenhower, just like Leonardo and Kate at the front of the Titanic, is just sort of at the front of that the boat of history, just going through it, never ever being pulled into anything. I mean, the only thing I can think of that Eisenhower gets any criticism for, and it's from some of the weirder people, is the kind of the deaths in the displacement camps post-war in Europe, the lack of getting the food, not getting enough food to the people there. But that's not a mainstream thing. That's not a Twitter type social media comment. That's only the real hardcore people who know about that history. But I think on everything else, Eisenhower is absolutely untouchable now, and I think deservedly so. I think he's in my interpretation for years and years, he's the one figure that's never come off my list of people I admire. I go in and out of all sorts of phases with regards to Montgomery and Patton and Clark and MacArthur, but Eisenhower has never once ever come off that top position in my absolute respect in my however many years I've spent studying this. Eisenhower's just always been number one in terms of what a brilliant guy he was.
Yeah. I mean, here, I'm sure as you know, he, I think, represents something to the country that people might feel is lost in the sense of, and I don't want to get into too much of the politics. I'll just leave it at that. Is that I think, particularly right now for this generation or my generation of Army officer, I think he's a manifestation of a thing that we feel like we may no longer have, that we should be going back to. The truly, the quiet intellect, the truly selfless military commander, and also, a brilliant leader who was able to pull together this, loose amalgamation, was able to handle all these different egos, able to manage Montgomery's personality, at least to some extent, manage Patton. And I guess, that is true, at least to some extent.
I mean, he found that mid-ground balance of, as you say, being able to bring in those from alternative views, which I agree, we've lost now. We are polarized. the reaction to anything is always now the complete opposite. There's never any attempt to find a mid-ground between two. It's if I think we should go left, someone no, the obvious way is right. It has to go in that polarized opposite view. And Eisenhower was very good at finding out it doesn't have to be left or right. It can be straight on. It can be, let's take a bit of yours. And it doesn't mean he's not firm in his decision making. He's not wishy-washy about it or anything. He's just got this ability to use all his resources and mobilize them, push them in what it's in a sense, it's symbolic by his broad front strategy. It's let's all go together, those on the left of the front and on the right of the front, but we'll all go forward in that same direction and I will manage it. I think that's a really good analogy I just came up with there about how he went through his leadership as a president almost. It's bringing the left and right together and moving forward on a front that we all agree is a general good way to move forward.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, maybe let's we covered a lot of ground here.
That's good. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Paul. Just always appreciate talking to you. You're always incredibly helpful. So, thanks for just providing this context here.
Well, that's what I've been doing the last years, is putting into context to stuff. That's been a revolution for me, is connecting all the study of World War II is so compartmentalized. People who study the Pacific, they don't study the ETO. The Holocaust is studied by Holocaust students. They don't look at the impact on the German war machine. And to me, it's always about connecting it all and making it sense of it. So you assess it on a broad front. But yeah, no, it's good. Good talking to you.
Okay. Great talk with Paul Woodadge. Great talking to him. I want to thank Paul Woodadge for joining the 18th Airborne Corps podcast. I want to thank you for listening. I want to encourage you to visit Paul's YouTube account, WW2TV on YouTube. A lot of great information and insight there. A lot of great information and insight here on the 18th Airborne Corps podcast. Please continue listening. Please subscribe if you have not done so already. And please leave a 5-star rating and a review. Thank you so much.